Yo, what is up, guys? Yes, it's been a hot minute since I've made any kind of Dungeon Quest content. Yes, I know Yokai Peak has been out for a little over a month now, but I still think that there needs to be an in-depth review about it because there's a lot wrong with Yokai Peak. There's also a lot that is right with it. I will point that out as well. But I believe that we have all deemed this dungeon as the easiest dungeon, so what went wrong with Yokai Peak? And that's what we're going to get into. A lot of stuff, and the community has made it glaringly known that they are very dissatisfied. So we need to band together here and just in a very constructive way show Roblox exactly what is happening with their dungeon. We want to go over the mob and boss attacks, spells, replayability, EXP scaling, loot scaling. There's a lot to talk about in a very short amount of time, so I'm going to try my best to get right into it. Now, first, I really do want to say that the dungeon is gorgeous. Like, obviously, Roblox team has come in and they have set a high bar for that aspect of the game that we're all, I think, very visually engaged with. Very, they have the cinematic effects of all of that, but they just very much lack the knowledge of how to pick up on the skill portion of the game. So Yokai Peak has been deemed as the easiest dungeon in Dungeon Quest. And I have to agree because on the release day, we were able to complete the dungeon straight off the first time around, and it really didn't take us very long to complete Nightmare. We got a few pieces from Insane, and then we attempted to complete Nightmare, and that was no problem at all. And so why? So let's just get into the mob attacks here. Let's just look at past progression trends, how war and mage attacks are coordinated, what is the dodgeability and difficulty level of this dungeon. So first we really need to look at the progression here. As we can see, the mob attacks typically will double for each dungeon, which would put Yokai Peaks at about 1.4 to 1.7 bill. That's what the mobs should be dealing out at this point. But they really don't. They deal out 730 to 933. There may be a couple of little bit heavier attacks with the barrel throws, but for the most part, we're still back in Gilded Skies. Some of the mob attacks in Gilded Skies were over 1 bill. So we're still on that level, which means that we don't have to run as high of HP. Now, I do want to take you back into Aquatic Temple, Enchanted Forest, Northern Lands, Gilded Skies, and just kind of take a peek at the skill level and dodgeability. So here we're looking at attacks that are coordinated from the war and the mages. They are longer attacks. That's no longer back in, Desert Temple or Winter Outpost where you had mobs that would just chase you around or that were slow. It was very easy to dodge. Now we have a lot of high damage and a lot of coordinated attacks that we have to deal with. And we run aggros in these dungeons to help coordinate how we can get the group to go through the dungeon smoothly with as less deaths as possible. And so in any case, so now that we've kind of seen a little bit of what we're dealing with the past dungeons, how does Yokai Peak actually stack up to this type of skill level? Okay, so in Yokai Peak, you're going to have the first group of mages and wars. And there's really not much of coordination between the two. You have mages that are delivering a long-range stun attack, but the wars are not really delivering anything with it, which makes them pretty much of a non-threat. And this is typical throughout all of Yokai Peak with the wars and the mages. So the mages here deliver the barrel throws, which you can avoid, but when you're running in a group, the group can get caught up into it. And here on the third set of groups, the mages deliver a longer line attack, and the wars are there to help finish you off, and they're going to be caught up into whoever is aggroing him at the time. So, but their attacks are so tiny that it's kind of a non-threat. So this falls very short of dungeon progression as far as skill level goes. We're at level 200 dungeon right now, and this is what we're seeing. This is back in the early days of Dungeon Quest as far as skill level. Okay, so we're going to look at boss attacks. We want to see if it follows the progression trends, dodging, team coordination. So let's just take a look at the progression trends for this dungeon. And currently we can see that again it follows the doubling aspect from dungeon to dungeon. Yokai Peak should be somewhere around 1.95 bill as their base damage and for all the high tick rate damage. It should also include anywhere from 5 bill to 25 bill plus some nuking going on like boss slams and things like that. Should be the heavier damage. All of this encourages a player to dodge during the game. Currently, Yokai Peak delivers flat rate and very low tick rate damage. As you can see, anywhere from 13 to 136 mil for a lot of their attacks is very, very low. And this discourages any kind of dodging when you can just sit through these attacks very, very easily and be healed right through them. So if we go back and look at Enchanted Forest, it had a lot of shredders on first boss, and they all delivered that base boss attack damage. So there was no sitting through them. It was, you just don't get hit by them. You really had to focus on your timing and your dodgeability efforts. Now there was a lot of RNG factors that made us crazy in that dungeon. And I would try as much as possible to encourage Voldex to not put as much RNG into their attacks. There is an acceptable amount, but you do have to think about the replayability of a dungeon when you do include a lot of RNG factors into it. Just in comparison, I want you to think about these attacks that some of these bosses deliver. Could you actually imagine if these attacks were at the base boss damage that they should be? People would actually be engaged in dodging them. There would be a very big skill level gap that you would have to learn as you go through the dungeon. But right now we can just sit through them and be healed through them. This is why technically you can actually run this dungeon with a healer that can be as a DPS as well, because we can time our heals appropriately and they can still deal damage as if they were a DPS player in the dungeon. There is nothing for them to worry about. There are no heavy attacks. There are no HP check attacks. There is nothing of the sort that's going to make you worry too much about surviving until the end of this dungeon. This is also why, as a DPS player playing hardcore dungeon, that our HP is so entirely low. There is really no heavy attacks that we have to worry about. We set our HP to handle 2 heavy attacks, and that happens to be 2 of the third and final boss attacks. You can survive 2 of those and then be healed. So again, there's really not much of a skill level in this dungeon, which lends it to being called the easiest dungeon in Dungeon Quest. Now there is still a lot to talk about. I know that there's a lot to deal with on spells, but I really kind of think that spells warrants another video for that. Voldex has gone through the ringer with the community on this subject, and well, you know, I just hope that they listen to the community a little bit better. We are still using Gilded Skies, even as I speak right now, a month and a half later after the release. We're still using it. It's still the meta because they are quick, they're efficient, they are the right length, and I can go into detail, but that would require another. Yes, they have fixed it to where it is at least runnable if that is all that you have as far as spells go. But if you are really into hardcore speedrunning, then you're going to have to use GS spells. So the last thing I really want to touch on very quickly is replayability of a dungeon. The biggest dungeon killers in Yokai Peak is first boss, the invulnerability period. If you have too much damage on that boss, it will go into invulnerability twice. So if somebody messes up and we don't actually be able to 2-cycle the boss properly, then we have to go into 2 of these invulnerability modes. It's annoying. The second thing in here is having to deal with the cut frames or cutscene. They obviously did fix it to where half the votes are needed, but it is annoying as all get out to actually have to do that. When you think about playability of a dungeon, you need to think about repeatability and how is that going to affect. It's fine for the first time. Ooh, wow. Okay. After that, I don't want to see it again. The last two things are EXP and loot. EXP was set correctly in the very beginning of this dungeon, and I'll tell you why. Yes, it was higher than the progression of dungeon to dungeon. Then they fixed it in line with what the progression is, but here is why it is wrong. This dungeon is twice as long as the normal dungeons that we have. So that means that I can still run GS and still just about have as much EXP as I would if I ran one of Yokai Peak. As a very high level player in this game, I can confirm to you that it takes a really long time for us to actually level up. And to have this EXP amount, I mean, that's one thing that we look forward to on new dungeons, is to have a little bit of an EXP bump in the very beginning. It encourages us to play, but when it is not scaled correctly, that's a big game killer. Same with the loot, it's the same thing. Obviously, we're not getting as much loot as we typically would in a dungeon. We're not getting as many drops. And when you think about this from a public player's scope, where they're only spending typically an hour to 3 hours a day on the game, they're not going to be getting as much loot as they would if this actually followed the dungeon progression. So it's going to take longer for a lot of us to get the things that we need, get the EXP we need to be able to level up. And that goes for every single player in this game. Well, if you've stuck with me this far, thank you so much. And I hope you enjoyed this video. You can show that love to me by giving it a big thumbs up. And you guys, I will see you in the next one.